I can do this. There you go. Do you know those mornings where you think, I thought earlier in the week it would be a great opportunity to talk about grief this morning, and now I'm regretting that because I've actually got to do it. Gosh. We, as Charlie said, we woke to the sad news on Wednesday that Geetha had passed in her sleep. Geetha and her husband Gopal were two of the founding members of Epsom Vineyard. So somebody referred to Geetha this week as Epsom Vineyard royalty. She's like the Queen. She's always been here. And we've all got a Geetha story, as we posted on Facebook and as you've shared with us directly. The amount of lovely, warm stories that have come out about Geetha. Things like people were saying she was always so kind and generous. She'd always ask about our kids. She just took a genuine interest. The messages of warmth were manifold, and it's even those of you who are relatively new around here, still people have shared this week how Geetha was the first person that greeted them when they came to Epsom Vineyard with, a warm smile and an even warmer coffee. Oh no, the other way around. And of course, those are just the nice stories. For those of you who knew Geetha for any length of time, you've probably also been told off by Geetha too. And I probably ought to start. But actually, who better to be told off by? What a treat! I probably ought to start with an apology, particularly if you're new here this morning. This may feel a bit like family business. I promise you it is, but it's not at the same time. Grief is a universal thing, and therefore, hopefully, some of this morning will be useful to all of you. Many of us have grieved at some point in our lives for two reasons. One, if you need to, it's largely involuntary. You can't do anything about it. And two, it's really good for us to grieve. It really is. So please think of this morning as a bit of a pause. It's not our normal church service, but think of it as an opportunity for us just to breathe together and grieve together. And for those of you who didn't know Geetha and have, or maybe never grieved for someone really close to you before, please take this is great wisdom this morning. I've nicked some great material from two really good psychologists in this field, one of the most widely read kings of all time, and a great British story writer by the name of C.S. Lewis, who sold over 200 million books. If you are new around here, I probably also need to apologize at this point too. Within our sermons, I don't just talk at you. We pause and we like to be able to reflect on what we're talking about, and we like to be able to just see what, if anything, God is saying to us in those moments. So, this morning, can you remember a time when someone you were close to died? Or maybe your parents got divorced, or you went through some other trauma, maybe you got divorced, but you went through something that had left you feeling either grief or loss. And if you can just bring to mind one of those emotions that you felt during that time, we're just going to give you a few moments to ponder that. If you would like to share it with the person next to you, please do. Don't feel like you have to. This is very personal stuff this morning, but honestly, as we talk about it, as we share, we help to process some of those things that our body always wants to process. So I'm just going to give you a couple of moments. Can you bring to mind one of the emotions you felt at a time when you were feeling grief or loss? Go. Cool. I shan't make you chat forever because it's, for some of you, this will be really awkward. For some of you, it should be good. The plus side of that question is there are really not any wrong answers, and there are an awful lot of right answers. Okay, back to C.S. Lewis. When his wife died, he wrote in his journal, actually, from the 10 days after his wife died, what he was thinking, feeling, processing. It was made later into a book which is called A Grief Observed. If you're ever trying to process grief and you're not quite sure what to do, it's really heavy. I must apologize on some levels, but it's really good stuff. So if you're trying to work out what this feels like, what this looks like, the way C.S. Lewis wrote about it is really helpful. And we're going to pull on that this morning. This is how the book starts. He says, "No one ever told me that grief felt so much like fear. I'm not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid. The same fluttering in my stomach, the same restlessness, the same yawing. I keep swallowing. At times it feels like I'm mildly drunk or concussed, and there's this sort of invisible blanket between the rest of the world and me. I find it hard to take in what anybody else says. I may end up crying this morning. When my own father died, we were at South West London Vineyard at the time. Don't cry because you'll set me off. I'm joking. Lawrence, I'm joking. John Mumford was my pastor and boss at the time, actually, and he sat me down and walked me through a thing called the Grieving Cycle. Mike, if you fancy popping that slide up. This is a very simplified version of it, and was one we pulled off the internet. John, I think, shared a scratty piece. This was in the days before Google's. He shared a scratty photocopied piece of paper and said, "Here you go." But he basically said to me, all these feelings you will feel over the next days, weeks, months, years. And he said, we're going to start this morning, go through them, but you may start in denial and come all the way around to acceptance, and then it'll start again. And indeed, for some of you this week, Geetha's passing will have triggered things. My dad died 26 years ago, but Geetha's passing still triggered in me some of those feelings that I felt 26 years ago. So I'm going to try and walk through some of these steps this morning. I must say this is really just a surface level look at how we grieve, but I promise you it was really good stuff to me when John first took me through it. I'm going to intersperse it with some of the Psalms that King David wrote. They're hilarious on some levels when you walk through them. If you don't read them through this lens of grief, you just read them and you go, okay. But when you read them through this lens, it's really helpful. What King David, C.S. Lewis, and I've forgotten their names, but the two really good psychologists that wrote the book on grief, they basically say the same things and how we grieve. One little preface for this cycle. When you're grieving, you may not feel them in this order. You may end up feeling some of them at the same time, but at least, and you may end up feeling a whole load of things that aren't on this cycle, but these are the things that most people will feel in the order that most people will process them. So it's helpful in terms of these are our shared similarities on that. So let's start at the top with denial. Denial, shock, disbelief, panic, or confusion. So this is often characterized as it can't be true. You may not actually say it out loud, but it's like you want to live like nothing has changed. I should say that for me, this was happening even before Geetha passed. I think 2 weeks before she died, we were in the Marsden with her, and she said, "Would you pray that the Lord would take me quickly?" And we were just really honest with her. We were like, we're not ready. We can't pray that yet, but we will pray that the Lord's will be done. Even before I saw her on Tuesday, we shared communion together with most of Geetha's family who are here today. I kind of hoped that she would be her bright and usual self. I didn't want to walk into a room where she was in her last day. Another description for this stage is often numbness. It's like we know we're supposed to feel something, but our bodies just won't let us yet. Okay, I'm going to try within this to talk about our biblical responses to each of these phases of the grief journey. So what's the biblical response to denial? It's quite simple and yet really hard at the same time. We need to be honest with ourselves. Of course, if you've ever done this, you're going to understand the paradox is you're trying to deny your pain at this point, so it's really hard to be honest with yourself. The thing that I've found most helpful at this time is when somebody else, a friend or a close loved one, can reflect back to you. Maybe they've gone into this process a little bit earlier than you have. I had this, one of the members of our church went to see Geetha over August, and she messaged me and she said, I saw this phase of life, this end-of-life phase in my own father. And I was essentially still in denial. I wanted at that point Geetha to be healed. But having an input from a good friend say, actually, this is where she's at, that was really helpful for me. King David's denial looked like this. This is from Psalm 55, if you wouldn't mind popping it up, Mike. He said, my heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen on me. Fear and trembling have beset me. Horror has overwhelmed me. I said, oh, that I have the wings of a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. I would flee far away and stay in the desert. I would hurry to the place of shelter far from the storm. I've never read this with the eyes of denial before, but essentially what King David is saying is, I just want to grow some wings and go somewhere else. I don't want to deal with this right now. Entering into the grieving process is terrifying and painful often. The internal message we tell ourselves, if I deny, if I don't enter into the process, I can avoid the pain. And of course, you can for a short time, but not for very long. So phase one of the grieving process is really about trying to avoid the pain of the grieving process. I promise you I'm a master at it. My default is to get involved with the whatever needs doing. If there is funeral arrangements to be done, that's where I find myself. But at some point, the Lord gently nudges us towards being honest with ourselves. And of course, he usually finds good friends or close family members to help us do that. So, phase two. I am whipping through these quite quickly, but I hope this gives you an idea. If you could put the slide back up, please, Mike, of the cycle. So this second phase is anger, hostility, blaming yourself, blaming others. And this is often characterized by, this isn't fair. The morning, I haven't actually shared this with Lorna, so I should apologize. The morning before Geetha died, Lorna and I had a discussion about this. I say it was discussion. It was mostly one-sided, and it was mostly Lorna sharing her anger that Geetha hadn't been healed. If you've not heard my mum's story about her cancer journey, and ultimately she's free of cancer at the minute, it's a wonderful story of healing. If you haven't heard it, if you go to YouTube, find the Epsom Vineyard channel, and then if you click on most popular, there's a few songs that are right at the top of the list, but of our live streams, Mum's live stream is the one that is most popular. She talks in it really powerfully about how she was healed from cancer, and we just always had that thing of, in fact, any of you who prayed for Geetha over the last few years, you probably were praying, Lord, healer of this cancer. So when that doesn't happen, and yet as Christians we believe that healing can happen, we can often get angry with God, with each other. You've got to remember, we get angry with the people we love the most because we get angry with the people we feel the safest with. So if you're in the room and you're one of your loved ones is experiencing grief, it may well be that they will be angry and you're like, why are you angry at me? They're not angry at you, they're just angry. It's just part of the grieving process. So again, what's the biblical response to anger? It's not to suppress it, ironically, which is what as Brits we tend to do. It's at this phase that we need to be honest with God. The first stage was honest with ourselves. The second stage is about being honest with the Lord. You only have to read a handful of King David's Psalms to realize there's a lot of honesty in the Bible. Psalm 10 reads this, really short verse. Why, Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble? Honestly, why? That question is probably one of the best questions we can ask God at this time. Why? I'm angry because I do not understand why. You may not get the immediate answer you're looking for. That often takes time, but why is a great, honest question. Okay, moving on to stage 3, depression, or feeling you feel tired, you feel hopeless, helpless, sometimes listless. I think for me, I hit this on Wednesday evening. We'd spent the whole day thinking about funeral arrangements. It was a lovely time together with Gopal's family, but at the same time, it's thoroughly exhausting emotionally to go through those things. So I got home, made dinner, then collapsed on the sofa with Calla, and we watched a few episodes of Ted Lasso. That's literally as much energy as I had just to press go on the remote. Okay, the next verse that's coming up, we all know because Jesus quoted it on the cross at his point of anguish. He said this, straight from King David, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out to you by day, but you do not answer. By night, but I find no rest. So what's the biblical response to depression within this grieving cycle? I know what you want me to say right now. You want me to say wine and Netflix. That's the biblical response. And there's lots of wine in the Bible, but sadly it's not the answer, although it probably is many of our default responses. The actual biblical response is slightly easier than that, and I promise you it's better than that. It's about asking God for his help. We have to get to the stage where we ask for help. We cannot keep it all to ourselves. Again, the irony, the paradox at this point is we least feel like we want to ask for help at this stage. And usually it's at the end of this phase where we'll be able to reach out eventually to God, because you're feeling at this point quite distant from the Lord. And you get to this stage where, at the end of this phase, where you're like, actually, God, I can't. I need you. I just need you. King David wrote about it beautifully in Psalm 23, which we prayed together on Tuesday with Geetha. He put it like this: even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. This picture of the God being our shepherd, comforting us. So the joy for us all is that in this time of asking for help, if you look at those two Psalms, God helps us to take us from that feeling of no rest. I lack peace. And he will take us to that place of comfort and peace. Okay, next phase is bargaining. And often this comes with a whole set of feelings of guilt. One of the things you do not expect to feel when you are grieving is guilty, but you do. This is often characterized as, if only I'd have been X. So for me, if only I'd have spent more time with Geetha. If only I'd have spent whatever it is. Before my dad died, I was down here, my dad was in Lancashire, and there was always that sense of, it was a probably an implied guilt, but sometimes a very explicit one of, you never see me enough. One friendly request. Please don't ever do that to your loved ones, no matter how much you feel in the right. Ultimately, the guilt alone reduces the quality of the relationship, so it's just not worth applying your guilt on somebody else. But of course, that's what we feel like we would like to do. Bargaining in the Psalms looks like this. Turn, Lord, and deliver me. Save me because of your unfailing love. Among the dead, no one proclaims your name. Who praises you from the grave? Now, I've never read this with this hat on before of bargaining, but essentially what David's saying is, don't kill me, Lord, or don't let me die, Lord, because I can't praise you when I'm dead. So it's it's almost hilarious. You're like, really? Is that what you're saying to God? But it appears that he is. So what's the biblical response to bargaining? At this phase, we need to ask God to help us see ourselves through his eyes, not through our own eyes. And not through the eyes of anyone else. Anyone who we're feeling guilty, other people might be feeling guilty. It's relationally, this is a really complicated part of the phase. So knowing how you are viewed by your Creator is the most healthy view of yourself you will ever have. And this isn't just in the grieving process, this is forever. If you know why you were created, how you were created, and who you were created by, and you are happy to live in that place, you will have the most healthy view of yourself you could possibly ever have. When David got to this stage, in Psalm 26, he said, next one please, Mike. Vindicate me, Lord, for I have led a blameless life. I've trusted you and have not faltered. Test me, Lord, and try me. Examine my heart and my mind. For I have always been mindful of your unfailing love and have lived in reliance on your faithfulness. David in this psalm, he's spending time with God, but he's bringing to mind some of the attributes of God and how they apply to his own life. This is how God is. This is how God in me looks too. We are made in his image. Okay, we are whipping through this quite quickly, but the final phase of the grief cycle is often referred to as acceptance. It's getting to that stage of acknowledging the loss and being prepared to move forward. Back to C.S. Lewis's book. He finishes literally at the end of the book, he finishes in a conversation with his dying wife and with God, who the chaplain's there as well, helping him to process this. His wife concludes, I am at peace with God, to which C.S. Lewis adds this nice little footnote. He said, she smiled, but not at me. C.S. Lewis's wife had moved on. She was smiling at God. She wasn't smiling at C.S. Lewis anymore. Geetha has moved on. She's smiling at Jesus right now. So eventually, we must move on too. For now, we only get to remember Geetha in our memories of her, our shared stories, as we've chatted about, what she meant to each of you. In those times where she doesn't serve you a coffee or doesn't ask you how your kids are, you may continue that grieving process. I'm not sure this is part of my grieving process, but I promise you, every time I see Gopal eating a biscuit from now on and not being told off by Geetha, I'll probably have a wry smile of like, those little memories, those happy things, the things that brought us joy when Geetha was alive. Eventually, we get to that place where we accept that she's moved on and so must we. Again, back to C.S. Lewis. He described this acceptance phase. He said, something quite unexpected has happened. It came this morning early. For various reasons, not in themselves all mysterious, my heart was lighter than it had been for many weeks. And suddenly, at that very moment, when I mourned her the least, I remembered her the best. At that very moment when I mourned her the least, I remembered her the best. And so what's our biblical response to this acceptance phase? It's quite simple, back to that thing of how seeing yourself in God's image, but at this point we can probably get to the stage where we can worship. The correct biblical response at the acceptance phase is to worship. Most of the grieving process we are not feeling ourselves. And most of it will not be feeling close to God either. You've got that distance. I'm discombobulated. I'm not quite who I think I should be. At this phase, we start to re-feel the peace of God, the presence of God, the closeness of God. And when we're feeling that, we're ready to worship. And it's usually because we're ready to reorient ourselves back to God. In the light of how God made us, we're made to worship. So we put ourselves back in line with God by worshipping him. The key message of Jesus was about the kingdom of God. And the kingdom of God really is about hope for a better future. And it's also about love being the benchmark for your living. So when we return to that place emotionally, we start to become really grateful. And gratitude often allows us to worship. Here's how King David put it in Psalm 30. He said this. He said, I will exalt you, Lord, for you lifted me out of the depths, and you did not let my enemies gloat over me. Lord my God, I called to you for help, and you healed me. You, Lord, brought me out of the realm of the dead. You spared me from going down to the pit. Sing praises to the Lord, you, his faithful people. Praise his holy name. For his anger lasts only a moment, but his favor lasts a lifetime. Weeping may stay for the night, but rejoicing comes in the morning. So back to another little point to ponder. Normally I'd ask you another question at this point, and I'd ask you to chat to your neighbour. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to give you a moment in silence just to reflect. It doesn't come up on the screen. This is just for you, a moment to reflect. And I want you to reflect on how you've grieved previously, and if there's anything from this morning as we've looked through the grief cycle, if God would highlight one of those things that he's helping you process this morning. Mike, if you can just pop the slide back up with the grief cycle, that would be really helpful. We're just going to sit in silence for 1 minute. You don't need to speak to anybody, but just reflect. Which one of these things has God been helping you with this more, highlighting with you this morning? And how, actually, just go with that. Which one of these things is God highlighting to you this morning? I'll just give you a moment. I'm just going to finish with a story about Geetha. I have to. When Laura and I were commissioned to lead Epsom Vineyard, just over 4 years ago, we were invited to stand at the front of church where we were going to be commissioned, where we were going to be prayed for. There was us, there was another 8 people who were coming with us, plus our children were there as well. And as we stood there waiting to be prayed for, Geetha was over here somewhere, and she came up out of her seat and she walked and she stood with us. She'd already said prior to that she wasn't going to join us at Epsom Vineyard, even though Gopal and Geetha lived within Borough. And after a few moments, somebody tapped Gopal on the shoulder and said, "Do you think you should follow your wife?" So Gopal came up as well. When I asked her about it afterwards, she said, I felt like someone had physically pushed me out of my seat. I didn't feel like I had an opportunity to not stand up with you. Her assumption in that moment was it was the Lord. The Lord had pushed her up, and nobody around her was near enough to actually physically push her. That started an adventure for Geetha and Gopal, which Geetha described as, she talked about being part of this church as, I've come alive as a Christian. She engaged in an adventure in the last 4 and a bit years of her life that she loved. When she came back from her niece's wedding earlier this year in America, she was admitted straight to the Marsden Hospital. We went to see her, and I remember she said, you'll never guess what. What? She said, I've started telling people about Jesus, complete strangers. She said, this is not my thing, but for the first time I feel like I need to tell people about Jesus. And there's an irony here. I've met many of Geetha's long-term friends this week for the first time, and I'll introduce myself. Hi, I'm Duncan. They'll go, oh, you're Duncan. I'm like, how do you know me? They'll say things like, Geetha's told us about your church. Geetha has invited us to your church. I'm a little bit worried that our church won't keep growing as much now that Geetha's no longer able to keep inviting people. C.S. Lewis put it like this towards the end of the book, A Grief Observed. He said, I know the 2 great commandments, and I better get on with them. Maybe that's all we need. Like Geetha and C.S. Lewis, perhaps that getting on with the 2 great commandments that Jesus left us is all we need. One final thought before we worship again. I promise you that this morning's sermon is really just scratching the surface of what grief is, how we process it, but hopefully gives, like it did for me, the grief cycle gives you a little bit of a framework for understanding what happens during that cycle. We always pray for each other at the end of our services. We will offer again prayer this morning. If you'd like a bit more prayer than just this morning, if you're in a life group, if you go and ask your life group leaders, please, they will help you pray for you. They'll help you process some of that. If you need a little bit more support, help, maybe counselling, Jackie, if you can just give us a wave. Jackie's a trained counsellor, a professional counsellor, I should say, even better than trained, and has a lot of friends within the counselling community who are local and understand some of our the joy of being Christian, amongst other things. So if you need some extra counselling, do come find Jackie and she'll chat to you, or come and find myself or Lorna. Grief looks different for everybody, and yet we share so many similarities with each other. Worship band, would you like to come up? Would you all like to stand? There you go. I don't know what I'm doing. Well aware that this might feel like a really strange time to worship, and yet it's still good for us. And ultimately, I just need you to always come back to that thing of, I'm pretty sure it's what Geetha would have wanted. Pat.